Let me see your identification, now.
I am Brigadier General Solomon Drayton, United States Army. What agency are you with, and do you have a warrant?
Uniform doesn't mean anything to me. We both know people dress up to look official.
This is my home. You are required to state your authority.
You fit the...
At 6:40 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Fayetteville, North Carolina, Brigadier General Solomon Drayton stepped out of his front door in full Army Class A dress uniform. He was 54 years old, a 30-year decorated combat veteran, and the deputy commander of Fort Liberty's 18th Airborne Corps. The ribbons on his chest told a story most people would never fully understand. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, 3 overseas deployments, 2 combat commands, a career built on discipline, precision, and sacrifice. That morning, he was heading to a promotion ceremony on post, where he would pin a star on a fellow officer and friend. It was supposed to be a proud day. Inside the house, his wife, Dr. Nadine Drayton, a neurologist at Cape Fear Valley Medical Center, stood at the kitchen window with a coffee mug in her hand, watching him walk toward the car. Their 16-year-old daughter, Amara, was upstairs getting ready for school, backpack half-packed on her bed. The street was quiet. Sprinklers clicked across lawns. A neighbor's dog barked once and stopped. Then 3 black SUVs turned the corner in a tight formation, moved down the block without slowing, and came to a hard stop across the Drayton driveway. The engines stayed running. The doors opened all at once, and Solomon Drayton, a general officer in the United States Army, stood alone on his own front lawn, watching 8 federal agents step out in tactical gear with their hands already on their weapons. The team was led by ICE Supervisory Agent Victor Pollard, 43 years old, 16 years in federal law enforcement. Pollard had built a career on aggressive field operations and high-volume arrest numbers. Inside his agency, he was known for running his teams hard and fast, often in neighborhoods where the residents were Black or Latino. He had 11 prior complaints of excessive force and racial targeting in his personnel file. Every single one had been internally reviewed and cleared. His supervisors described him in evaluations as intense but effective. Officers who had worked under him used different words. His second that morning was Agent Craig Fenton, 36, 6 years on the job. Fenton had never once filed a dissenting report. He backed Pollard's calls without question, co-signed every use of force narrative, and stayed quiet when others raised concerns. He was the kind of agent who followed rather than thought, the kind whose silence made everything worse. Their team of 6 additional agents exited the SUVs in full tactical gear, ballistic vests, sidearms drawn, boots on a suburban sidewalk at sunrise. Not one of them had activated a body camera. Department policy required recording during all enforcement operations. Pollard's teams had failed to comply with that policy on more than 40 documented occasions, nearly all of them in communities of color. No one had ever been disciplined for it. That pattern would matter later. But in that moment, standing on a quiet residential street in front of a general's home, the cameras were dark, the weapons were out, and the agents were moving toward the driveway like they had already decided how this was going to end. Pollard reached the driveway first. He didn't introduce himself, didn't show credentials, didn't explain why 8 armed agents were standing on a private lawn at sunrise. He looked Drayton up and down, eyes passing over the ribbons, the rank insignia, the pressed uniform, and none of it registered as relevant. He spoke like a man who had done this 100 times before. "I need to see identification." Drayton's posture didn't shift. His voice was calm, measured, the tone of someone who had commanded thousands of soldiers under far worse pressure than this. "I'm Brigadier General Solomon Drayton, United States Army. This is my home. What agency are you with, and do you have a warrant?" Pollard ignored both questions. "Turn around." Drayton didn't move. He held eye contact. "Sir, I've asked you a direct question. Do you have a warrant?" Fenton stepped around to Drayton's left side, closing the space behind him without a word. 2 more agents fanned out across the lawn. Drayton stayed still. He could feel the positioning. He understood what it meant. Across the street, retired Marine Colonel Edwin Hargrove, 71, white, a combat veteran who had served 3 tours in Vietnam, stepped out onto his front porch in a bathrobe and slippers. He saw the SUVs, the tactical gear, the drawn weapons, and a man in army dress blues standing alone against all of it. He pulled out his phone and began recording. Upstairs in the Drayton home, Amara had moved to the window. She pressed her phone to the glass, hands trembling, and hit record. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The image spoke for itself. Her father, in full uniform, surrounded on his own property by men who hadn't even told him why they were there. Pollard finally offered something resembling an explanation, but only after Drayton asked a third time. "We have an administrative warrant for an individual at this address." Drayton's expression didn't change. "What name is on the warrant?" Pollard glanced at a folded document in his hand. The name he read out loud did not belong to anyone in the Drayton household, had never belonged to anyone at that address. Drayton said so immediately. "That person does not live here. I've owned this home for 9 years. I can show you my military ID and the deed." He reached slowly toward his breast pocket. Pollard's hand moved to his sidearm. "Don't reach for anything." Drayton froze. "I'm reaching for my identification, that's all." Pollard shook his head. "We'll sort it out downtown. You're coming with us." Drayton's voice stayed level, but the edge was there now. "I am not going anywhere without a warrant bearing my name. That is my right." For a moment, no one moved. Then Pollard grabbed Drayton's right arm. Fenton seized the left. The motion was fast, coordinated, practiced. They drove him forward and down. A 1-star general in full-dress uniform hit the concrete of his own driveway, face first. The sound was a dull crack, followed by the scrape of metal on pavement as his metals dragged across the surface. His cap rolled off and came to rest in the grass. His chin split on impact. Blood spotted the concrete beneath his face. Drayton did not resist. He did not swing. He did not shout. He lay still with his arms pulled behind his back and said 5 words, loud enough for every camera and every neighbor now stepping outside to hear. "I am not resisting arrest." The front door slammed open. Nadine Drayton came down the steps barefoot, coffee mug abandoned somewhere behind her. She saw her husband face down on the driveway, 2 agents kneeling over him, blood on the concrete beneath his chin. She screamed his name. 2 agents stepped into her path before she reached the bottom step. Their bodies formed a wall on her own porch. Nadine's voice broke through the morning air, sharp enough to carry across the block. "That is my husband! Show me a warrant! Give me your badge numbers and your names right now!" The agent closest to her leaned in and lowered his voice. "Go back inside before this gets worse for your husband." The threat was quiet and deliberate, and Amara's phone caught every word from the upstairs window. The 16-year-old was sobbing, hands shaking so badly the footage would later show a constant tremor across the frame. But she didn't stop recording. She watched her father, a general who had led soldiers through combat, lying face down on his own driveway, with his dress uniform grinding into the pavement. Drayton heard his wife's voice. He heard the fear in it. He heard his daughter crying above him. And from the concrete, with blood running down his chin and both arms pinned behind his back, he spoke. "Nadine, Amara, stay calm. I'm okay. Do not come outside." His voice was steady, the voice of a man trained to lead under fire. But the cameras caught what his tone tried to hide: the blood on his face, the torn fabric at his shoulder, and the expression of a father who could not protect his family from the people standing on his own lawn. Colonel Edwin Hargrove crossed the street in his bathrobe with his phone held steady at chest height. He walked with the unhurried pace of a man who had spent decades in places far more dangerous than a suburban sidewalk. He stopped at the edge of the driveway and spoke clearly. "I'm Colonel Edwin Hargrove, United States Marine Corps, retired. I am recording this interaction. I want to know what authority you're operating under and whether you have a warrant for this man." Pollard didn't look up from where he knelt on Drayton's back. "Sir, step away or you'll be charged with obstruction." Hargrove didn't move, not 1 inch. That man is a brigadier general in the United States Army. He is a flag officer in the armed forces. You are making a career-ending mistake. Pollard looked up then. His expression was hard, dismissive. I don't care if he's the president. He fits the description. The words landed in the open air, where every phone microphone within 50 feet picked them up. Hargrove's recording captured Pollard's face as he said it, captured the knee still pressing into a general's back, captured the metals flat against the driveway. Down the block, doors were opening. A woman 2 houses east stood on her porch with her phone raised. A man walking his dog stopped at the corner filming. A teenager in a parked car had his window down and his camera pointed at the scene. Within minutes, there were 9 civilian recordings from 7 different angles, and every single one showed the same thing. A black man in full military dress uniform, pinned to his own property by armed agents who had no warrant with his name on it and no intention of letting him explain. Pollard stood Drayton up by the cuffs. The motion was rough, deliberate. Drayton's uniform was torn at the right shoulder where the fabric had caught against the concrete. The ribbons on his chest were scuffed. The bronze star sat crooked against the Purple Heart. Blood had dried along his jawline in a thin, dark line. Pollard walked him to the rear SUV and opened the back door. Drayton ducked his head and sat without a word. He didn't look back at his house. He didn't need to. He knew Nadine was watching. He knew Amara was still at the window. Fenton climbed into the passenger seat. The SUV pulled out of the driveway and turned east toward the federal processing facility across the city. Through the rear window, Drayton's ribbons were still visible, pinned to the chest of a man who had earned every one of them in places most of these agents would never see. On the front steps, Nadine stood with both hands shaking. The agents who had blocked her were walking back to the remaining vehicles. No one offered an explanation. No one left a card. She pulled out her phone and dialed Fort Liberty's Provost Marshal office. Then she called their attorney. Her voice cracked once on the second call, and then steadied. They just took my husband off our property in handcuffs. He's a brigadier general. They had no warrant with his name on it. The SUV was already 3 miles away. A general sat in the back seat behind tinted glass, and there was not a single piece of paperwork anywhere in that vehicle that justified his presence in it. The federal processing facility was a low, gray building with fluorescent lighting and the smell of disinfectant in every hallway. Drayton was walked through a side entrance, still in cuffs, still in his torn dress uniform. The intake officer looked at him, looked at the ribbons, looked at the rank on his shoulders, and said nothing. He was placed in a holding cell with a metal bench and a steel door. No phone call, no explanation of charges, no access to counsel. 3 hours passed. Drayton sat with his back straight and his hands folded, the same posture he held in briefing rooms and command meetings. He asked twice to contact his chain of command. Both times the request was ignored. The third time, a supervising agent passing the cell stopped and looked in through the narrow window. Drayton spoke clearly. I am Brigadier General Solomon Drayton, United States Army. I need to contact my command immediately. The agent smirked. Everyone in here says there's somebody. He kept walking. But somewhere in the building, protocol was finally catching up with what Pollard had set in motion. Drayton's fingerprints had been scanned at intake. His military ID had been entered into the system. The results came back in seconds. Active duty flag officer. Deputy Commander, 18th Airborne Corps. Top secret / SCI security clearance. No outstanding warrants, no criminal record. 30 years of service. The intake officer read the screen twice. Then he picked up the phone and called his supervisor. The supervisor came down the hall at a pace just short of running. He looked through the cell window at a man in a torn dress uniform sitting perfectly still on a metal bench. And for the first time since the SUVs had rolled up to that driveway, the room went quiet. Nadine's call reached the Fort Liberty Provost Marshal at 7:14 a.m. By 7:22, the 18th Airborne Corps Command Duty Officer had been notified. By 7:35, the Army's Office of the Staff Judge Advocate was on a secure line with the Corps Chief of Staff. The words were simple. One of our flag officers has been detained by federal agents at his home without a valid warrant. Within the hour, NCIS was looped in because of the joint service implications. The Pentagon's Office of General Counsel was alerted shortly after. A JAG colonel named David Sumner picked up his phone at Fort Liberty and dialed the ICE field office directly. His tone was not a request. "I'm calling on behalf of the 18th Airborne Corps regarding the unlawful detention of Brigadier General Solomon Drayton. You will release him immediately." The field office supervisor pulled up the arrest file while still on the line. What he found was what anyone who had looked from the beginning would have found. No valid warrant for Solomon Drayton. No matching name. No probable cause. The warrant listed a different individual who had never been associated with the Drayton household or that address. The supervisor asked how Drayton had been brought in. When told the details, he went silent. Then he asked if body cameras had been activated. No. Witnesses? Multiple. Was the general injured? Yes. He set the phone down, walked into his office, and closed the door. The panic that followed was quiet but absolute, because every person in that building now understood that what had happened that morning was not a procedural error. It was a federal incident. Drayton was released at 10:47 a.m. No charges filed, no apology offered. He walked out in the same torn uniform he had been wearing when they put him on the ground 4 hours earlier. His chin was cut. His wrists carried deep red marks from the cuffs. His right shoulder was stiff where the joint had been wrenched during the takedown. A JAG officer, Major Constance Adler, was waiting in the parking lot. She drove him home without small talk. Drayton stared out the window with his hands resting on his knees, palms open, the way a man sits when he is holding something back. When the car turned onto his street, the scene had changed. Nadine was on the front lawn. Amara was beside her, eyes swollen. Colonel Hargrove stood near the driveway, phone still in his hand. 2 Army CID agents in plain clothes had arrived 20 minutes earlier and were documenting everything. Scuff marks on the concrete, a bloodstain near the front tire track, a service cap still lying in the grass where it had rolled that morning. Neighbors had gathered along the sidewalk. Some had been there since the SUVs left. Drayton stepped out of the car, and Nadine crossed the lawn to meet him. She didn't say anything. She just held him. Amara followed. Inside the house, military attorneys were already reviewing 2 phone recordings. Amara's footage from the upstairs window showed the full confrontation from above. Hargrove's video captured it from street level with clear audio. And a neighbor's Ring doorbell camera had recorded the entire arrest from a third angle, wide and unbroken, including the moment Pollard looked up and said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "I don't care if he's the president. He fits the description." Within 48 hours, 3 parallel investigations were open and moving fast. The DHS Office of Inspector General launched a formal inquiry into the conduct of the agents involved. Army CID opened its own case focused on the unlawful seizure of a flag officer and the treatment of his family. And the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division assigned a team to assess whether federal civil rights laws had been violated. Pollard and Fenton's personnel files were pulled the same day. What investigators found was not a surprise to anyone who had worked alongside Pollard, but it was damning on paper. 11 prior complaints of excessive force and racial targeting. Every single one internally reviewed. Every single one cleared. Body camera logs confirmed that neither agent had activated their cameras the morning of the arrest. Department policy required activation for all enforcement operations. A deeper audit revealed that Pollard's teams had failed to activate cameras on more than 40 prior operations. Nearly all of them took place in Black or Latino neighborhoods. No disciplinary action had ever been taken. Then the emails surfaced. Internal communications between Pollard and his direct supervisor showed a pattern of awareness at the leadership level. In one message flagged by investigators, the supervisor acknowledged the volume of complaints against Pollard's unit and described him in writing as aggressive but effective. That phrase would appear in federal court filings within the month. It would be quoted in headlines within the week. And it would become the single most cited piece of evidence that the agency had known exactly who Victor Pollard was and had chosen to look the other way. 3 days after the arrest, the videos went public. Amara Drayton, with her parents' permission, posted her recording from the upstairs window to social media. The footage was shaky and raw. It showed her father standing alone in dress uniform on his own driveway, surrounded by agents in tactical gear. It showed the moment Pollard and Fenton drove him face first into the concrete. It showed the metals scraping the pavement. It showed her mother blocked on the front steps by men who wouldn't give their names. Hargrove's footage followed hours later, filmed from street level with steady hands and clear audio. His video captured Pollard's voice without distortion. Every order, every refusal to show a warrant, every word. Then the family's attorney released the Ring doorbell footage from the neighbor's camera across the street. The angle was wide and unbroken, capturing the full scene from the moment the SUVs arrived to the moment they pulled away with a general in the back seat. Combined, the 3 recordings left no room for ambiguity. A decorated black officer in full military dress thrown to the ground in his own driveway by federal agents who had no warrant bearing his name, while his wife was physically blocked and his teenage daughter watched from a window. The videos reached 10 million views in 3 days. National media picked it up within 24 hours. By the end of the week, every major outlet had run the story. The Pentagon issued a rare public statement confirming the incident and calling it an unacceptable violation of a service member's rights and dignity. Inside the ICE field office, phones stopped ringing with routine calls and started ringing with requests from congressional offices, inspector general liaisons, and defense attorneys preparing for what everyone now understood was coming. The fallout inside ICE was swift and systematic. Pollard and Fenton were placed on unpaid suspension within 72 hours of the arrest. Their firearms were confiscated, their credentials deactivated, their access to federal systems revoked. 6 additional agents who had been on the driveway that morning were reassigned to administrative duties pending internal review. Pollard's direct supervisor, the man who had written aggressive but effective in an email he never expected anyone outside the agency to read, was placed on administrative leave. The ICE director issued an internal memo to every field office in the country. The language was blunt. What occurred in Fayetteville represents an institutional failure at every level. It was a failure of leadership, a failure of oversight, and a failure to uphold the standards this agency is sworn to maintain. The DHS secretary went further. In a public statement carried by every major network, he confirmed that the arrest of Brigadier General Solomon Drayton was unlawful and that the department would cooperate fully with all ongoing investigations. Behind closed doors, the language was sharper. A senior DHS official told a room of agency attorneys that this was the worst single-incident civil rights exposure the department had faced in a decade. A federal grand jury was convened in the Eastern District of North Carolina. Prosecutors presented the video evidence, the personnel records, the complaint history, and the internal emails. They laid out a pattern that went beyond one morning on one driveway. Pollard's union representative attended the first day of proceedings and afterward called Pollard directly. His advice was short. Retain private counsel immediately. This is beyond what we can protect you from. Pollard hung up the phone, and for the first time since that Tuesday morning, the weight of what he had done began to settle. The grand jury returned indictments within 2 weeks. Victor Pollard was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, under 18 U.S.C. 242, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. Craig Fenton was indicted as a co-conspirator for his direct role in the unlawful arrest and his years-long pattern of enabling Pollard's conduct without challenge. Their field supervisor was charged with failure to supervise and obstruction of justice for attempting to delay the release of internal complaint records in the days following the arrest. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. The jury watched all 3 videos in sequence. Amara's footage from the upstairs window, Hargrove's recording from the street, the Ring camera's wide, unbroken angle from across the driveway. They heard testimony from Drayton, who described the arrest with the same precision he brought to operational briefings. From Nadine, whose voice broke once when she described being told things would get worse for her husband if she didn't go inside. From Amara, who was asked what she saw from the window and answered, "I saw my father on the ground in his uniform, and I couldn't help him." From Colonel Hargrove, who told the court he had served in 3 wars and never seen an American service member treated that way on home soil. The jury reviewed the 11 prior complaints, the 40 operations without body cameras, the emails, the pattern. Deliberations lasted less than a day. Pollard was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Fenton was convicted and sentenced to 3 years. The supervisor received 18 months. All 3 were permanently barred from federal law enforcement. Their names were entered into the National Decertification Index. No federal agency would ever employ them again. The Drayton family filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against ICE, DHS, and the individual agents. The complaint cited unlawful detention, excessive force, racial profiling, Fourth Amendment violations, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The video evidence, the testimony, and the internal records made the case impossible to defend. The government settled before trial for $4.2 million, plus sweeping mandated reforms. Mandatory body camera activation with termination-level penalties for non-compliance. Independent civilian oversight of all warrant execution operations. A verification protocol requiring confirmed name match before any detention. And quarterly public reporting on use of force demographics broken down by race, location, and outcome. Drayton returned to duty within weeks. He never publicly discussed the settlement. He never appeared on television. He went back to work the same way he had walked out of his front door that morning. In uniform, on time, posture straight, voice steady. Months later, he was promoted to Major General. In his first address after the ceremony, standing before a room of officers and officials at Fort Liberty, he said one thing that made the room go still. "I have led soldiers into combat zones where the rules of engagement were clearer than what those agents followed in my own driveway." No one spoke for several seconds. Across DHS, a training bulletin was distributed to every field office in the country. It included a still frame from Amara Drayton's phone video. The image showed a man in full Army dress uniform lying face down on residential concrete, his medals flat against the pavement, his hands behind his back. The caption read, "This is what happens when bias replaces procedure." No names were printed. They didn't need to be. The careers were already gone. This case was disturbing, but the one on the right ends in a way no one expects.
On the ground, don't move! I'm Colonel Nathaniel Drummond, United States Marine Corps. You have the wrong person.
Yeah, they all say that when they get caught.
You think we don't know why you're here? People like you don't just end up in houses like this. This is my home. I've lived here 9 years.
At 6:14 a.m. on a quiet Saturday morning in Ashburn, Virginia, 4 federal agents in tactical vests forced a black man face down onto his own driveway. The man was Colonel Nathaniel Drummond, an active-duty United States Marine with 26 years of service, 3 combat deployments, a Bronze Star with Valor, and a Purple Heart pinned to a career most people couldn't survive, let alone build. He had been washing his truck in a USMC PT shirt and shorts when 2 unmarked black SUVs pulled up hard and fast, tires biting the curb. 4 ICE agents jumped out with weapons drawn before a single word was spoken. The lead agent, a senior field officer with a history that should have ended his career years ago, barked at Drummond to get on the ground. No names were confirmed. No warrant was produced. No questions were asked. They saw a black man standing in a nice neighborhood and decided he didn't belong. Inside the house, Drummond's 4-year-old son Elijah stood at the front window watching his father, a man who had survived Fallujah, get slammed onto the concrete by men who never once asked who he was. The agents forced his wrists behind his back and zip-tied them tight enough to leave marks that would be photographed in a hospital 3 hours later. What those agents didn't know, what they hadn't bothered to find out, was that the man bleeding on the driveway held one of the highest security clearances in the Department of Defense, that phones at Marine Corps Base Quantico would be ringing within minutes, and that every second of what they were doing was being recorded by a neighbor's doorbell camera in crystal clear, high-definition video that would eventually be played in a federal courtroom. Colonel Nathaniel Drummond was not just any Marine. He was 48 years old with 26 years of active duty service that read like a blueprint for everything the military asks a person to become. 3 combat deployments, the first in Fallujah during some of the most violent urban warfare since Vietnam, the second in Helmand Province during the height of the Afghan surge, and the third a classified special operations mission in East Africa that would never appear in any public record. He had earned a Bronze Star with Valor for actions under fire that saved the lives of 7 Marines in his unit. He had received a Purple Heart after taking shrapnel during an ambush that killed 2 men beside him. He had risen through the ranks with a discipline and quiet authority that made him one of the most respected officers in his command. At the time of the incident, he was serving as Deputy Director of Logistics at Marine Corps Base Quantico, one of the highest-ranking black officers in the entire installation's command structure. His wife, Dr. Simone Drummond, 45, was a trauma surgeon at a Level 1 trauma center in Washington, who had spent her career saving lives in operating rooms where seconds meant the difference between survival and death. They had built their home in the Ashburn neighborhood 9 years earlier, drawn by the schools and the quiet streets. Drummond coached Little League every spring. He organized a veterans breakfast at the local VFW hall the first Saturday of every month, cooking eggs and pouring coffee for men and women who had served alongside him or before him. His neighbors didn't just know him, they trusted him. He was the man they called when the power went out or when someone needed a ride to the VA. He was the most respected person on that street, and on that Saturday morning, he was zip-tied and bleeding on his own property while his son watched from behind glass. The man who led the operation was Senior Field Agent Dale Kircher, 44 years old, with 16 years inside ICE's enforcement and removal operations. Kircher had built a reputation within the agency that should have raised alarms long before that Saturday morning. He was known among field teams as aggressive, efficient, and untouchable, a combination that in practice meant he did whatever he wanted and no one above him cared enough to stop it. Over the past 3 years, 83% of Kircher's targeted enforcement actions had involved Black or Latino individuals living in predominantly white neighborhoods. 7 formal complaints had been filed against him for excessive force, 5 more for unlawful detention. Every single one had been internally reviewed and quietly dismissed with language like inconclusive findings or within operational discretion. Kircher had learned the same lesson that men like him always learn when systems protect them instead of correcting them, that he could keep going. His partner that morning was Agent Troy Skaggs, 31, just 4 years on the job and already molded in Kircher's image. Skaggs was eager, reckless, and loyal in the worst possible way. He never questioned a call. He never pushed back on a tactic. He laughed when Kircher laughed, moved when Kircher moved, and stayed silent when silence meant complicity. 2 other agents rode in the second SUV, junior field officers who stayed near the vehicles and watched the whole thing unfold from the curb. They didn't intervene. They didn't speak up. They stood with their hands on their vests and let it happen, which in the eyes of the federal investigators who would later review every second of that morning made them part of it. Nathaniel Drummond lay face down on the concrete of his own driveway, wrists pulled behind his back and zip-tied so tight the plastic bit into his skin. His voice was steady, controlled, the voice of a man trained to stay calm when everything around him was falling apart. "I'm Colonel Nathaniel Drummond, United States Marine Corps. I'm active duty." "You have the wrong person." Kircher didn't look at him, didn't pause, didn't check. "Yeah, heard that one before." Skaggs crouched beside Drummond and patted him down aggressively, hands moving fast and rough across his PT shirt and shorts as if a man washing his truck at dawn was concealing something dangerous. That was when the front door flew open. Elijah Drummond, 14 years old, ran barefoot onto the driveway screaming, "Dad, "What are you doing to my dad?" Kircher spun toward the boy and pointed. "Get back inside now. Do not come out here again." The boy froze, eyes wide, chest heaving. A neighbor across the street, Franklin Osei, a retired Air Force Master Sergeant who had served 22 years in uniform, stepped off his porch and crossed the road. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. "That man is a colonel in the United States Marine Corps." Kircher's voice turned sharp. "Sir, step back or I will arrest you for obstruction." Another neighbor, 2 houses down, raised her phone and began recording. Kircher didn't notice. Seconds later, a silver sedan turned into the driveway. Dr. Simone Drummond stepped out, still wearing surgical scrubs from her overnight shift. She saw her husband on the ground, zip ties on his wrists, blood on his chin from where his face had hit the concrete. Her training kicked in before her fear did. She pulled out her phone and opened a voice memo. "I am Dr. Simone Drummond. I am observing a laceration to my husband's chin, bruising on both wrists, possible abrasion to his left shoulder. He is face down and restrained." She looked at Kircher. "Where is your warrant?" Kircher stepped toward her. "Ma'am, step back or you will be detained." Simone didn't move. "Where is your warrant?" she asked again. And Kircher, for the first time that morning, had no answer. Kircher finally offered a reason, though it barely qualified as one. He said they were executing a targeted enforcement action on an individual suspected of immigration fraud and identity theft. Someone allegedly living at this address under a false identity. The name he gave was not Nathaniel Drummond. It wasn't even close. The name belonged to a person who didn't match Drummond's age, his description, or any record tied to that property. Drummond, still face down on the concrete with zip ties cutting into his wrists, said it again. "This is my house. I've lived here for 9 years. I am a United States citizen born in Charlotte, North Carolina. I am a colonel in the United States Marine Corps. My military ID is in my wallet on the kitchen counter. You can verify everything in 30 seconds. Kircher didn't go inside, didn't send Skaggs to check, didn't radio anyone to run the name. He looked down at Drummond the way a man looks at someone whose words don't matter and said, "We'll sort it out at the field office." Skaggs grabbed one arm, Kircher grabbed the other. They pulled Drummond to his feet and began walking him toward the SUV. His son was still standing in the doorway, tears running down his face, calling his father's name. Simone was still holding her phone, still recording, still demanding to see a warrant that didn't exist, because there was no warrant, no judge had signed one, no probable cause had been established. No verification of any kind had been done before 4 armed federal agents rolled into a quiet Virginia neighborhood and dragged a decorated Marine colonel off his own property in front of his own family. By the time Kircher and Skaggs loaded Drummond into the back of the first SUV, at least 4 neighbors were recording on their cell phones. One woman across the street had stepped onto her porch with her camera held high, capturing the agents from a wide angle. A couple 2 doors down filmed from their front yard, close enough to pick up voices. Franklin Osei, the retired Air Force Master Sergeant, held his phone steady from the sidewalk, narrating under his breath what he was watching unfold. But the most important footage came from a device none of the agents even noticed. A Ring doorbell camera mounted on the house directly across from the Drummond driveway had an unobstructed wide-angle view of the entire scene. It captured everything from the moment the SUVs pulled up to the moment Drummond was placed in the vehicle. Every shove, every command, every second of a 1-4-year-old boy watching his father get taken. And here was the detail that would later become the center of the federal investigation. Kircher's body camera was not activated. Skaggs' body camera was not activated. Neither of the 2 junior agents standing by the second vehicle had activated theirs. All 4 agents were equipped with body-worn cameras. All 4 were required under federal policy to activate them during any enforcement action, and all 4 had chosen not to. When investigators later pulled the activation logs, they found that Kircher had failed to record on more than 60 prior enforcement actions over the past 3 years. Skaggs had 23 gaps in his own record. The pattern wasn't accidental. It was habitual, And in the eyes of federal prosecutors, it suggested something far worse than negligence. It suggested that these agents knew exactly what they were doing, and they didn't want it on tape. What they hadn't counted on was a neighborhood full of people who refused to look away. Simone Drummond stood in the driveway watching the SUV pull away with her husband in the back seat. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was already moving. She scrolled through her phone, found the number she needed, and called Nathaniel's commanding officer at Marine Corps Base Quantico directly. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. She told him everything. 4 ICE agents, no warrant, no correct name, no identification check. Her husband zip-tied and bleeding on his own driveway, their son watching from the door. Within 90 seconds of that call ending, the information was moving up the chain of command at a speed that only the military understands when one of its own has been touched. A Marine colonel with active duty status and top-secret security clearance had been detained by federal agents on his own property without a warrant, without verifying his identity, and without even using the correct name. Within 8 minutes, calls were being made from Quantico to the Pentagon, from the Pentagon to the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General's office. From DHS to ICE Field Command in Washington, a JAG attorney was dispatched from Quantico with orders to locate Drummond and ensure his immediate release. The Marine Corps does not make polite requests when one of its colonels is dragged off American soil in zip ties. The message that moved through every channel that morning was direct and left no room for interpretation. Release him immediately, or this becomes a federal incident within the hour. The people on the other end of those calls understood exactly what that meant. But by the time those calls reached the right desks, Dale Kircher had already made his next mistake. Despite the calls now burning through federal phone lines, Kircher transported Drummond to the ICE field office as if nothing had changed. He walked him through the back entrance, past 2 supervisors who didn't ask a single question, and placed him in a holding cell. The zip ties were removed and replaced with metal cuffs. Drummond sat on a steel bench in a PT shirt, shorts, and no shoes. The cell was cold. The lights were fluorescent and constant. For 2 hours and 47 minutes, a decorated Marine colonel with 26 years of service to his country sat in federal custody without being read his rights, without being offered water, and without being allowed to make a phone call. He asked twice to speak to someone in charge. Both times he was told to sit tight. He asked for the name of the individual they were looking for. No one answered. He told them again who he was. No one checked. It wasn't until a shift supervisor returning from break finally decided to run the name Nathaniel Drummond through the system that everything came apart. The screen lit up with a record that should have been pulled before the SUVs ever left the parking lot. United States citizen. Born Charlotte, North Carolina. Active duty, United States Marine Corps. Rank, Colonel. Current duty station, Marine Corps Base Quantico. Security clearance, top secret. The supervisor stared at the screen, then looked down the hall toward the holding cell where a man in workout clothes sat cuffed to a bench. The person they had actually been looking for didn't match Drummond in name, age, physical description, or address history. Not one detail overlapped. Federal investigators would later describe the operation as catastrophically negligent intelligence work and racially motivated target selection. The supervisor picked up the phone. His hand was shaking. Not because he felt sorry for the man in the cell, but because he understood what was about to come down on everyone who had touched this case. They released him without apology. No one from the team that had arrested him was present. Kircher had clocked out while Drummond was still sitting in the holding cell, as if the morning had been routine, as if dragging an innocent man from his own driveway was just another shift. A junior supervisor whose name Drummond would never remember handed him a clear plastic bag containing his wallet, his watch, and his house keys. There was a miscommunication, the supervisor said, not meeting his eyes. That was the only explanation offered to a man who had spent nearly 3 hours cuffed in a federal holding cell for the crime of being black in his own neighborhood. Simone was waiting in the parking lot. She didn't speak when he got in the car. She didn't need to. She could see the bruises ringing both wrists where the zip ties had been pulled too tight. She could see the laceration on his chin, still raw and dark with dried blood. She watched him lower himself into the seat slowly, favoring his left side, his shoulder visibly swollen beneath the thin PT shirt. On the drive home, Nathaniel said nothing. He stared through the windshield at a country he had served for 26 years and said absolutely nothing. Simone didn't drive home. She drove to the emergency room. She had every injury formally documented by medical professionals who photographed the bruising, measured the laceration, noted the shoulder inflammation, and entered it all into a medical record that would later be submitted as evidence. When they finally pulled into their driveway that afternoon, Elijah was sitting on the front steps. He hadn't stopped shaking since the arrest. That week, the nightmares started. He woke up screaming on the second night. By the fourth night, he stopped sleeping through at all. He asked his father on the fifth morning, quiet and serious in a way no one 4-year-old should ever have to be, "Are the men coming back?" Nathaniel didn't have an answer that would fix what had been broken. A child who had once felt safe in his own home no longer did, and no settlement, no investigation, no federal prosecution would ever fully give that back. Within 48 hours, the United States Marine Corps formally requested a federal investigation through the Department of Defense. The request did not go through normal channels. It went straight to the top. The DHS Inspector General opened an immediate inquiry into the actions of all 4 agents involved in the detention. The FBI Civil Rights Division was notified and began coordinating with federal prosecutors. 2 members of the House Armed Services Committee issued public statements demanding a full accounting of how an active-duty Marine colonel with top-secret clearance was arrested without a warrant, without identification, verification, and without even the correct name. Behind closed doors, the language was sharper. A senior Pentagon official told a room of Defense Department attorneys that what happened in that driveway was not a miscommunication. It was a civil rights violation carried out by federal agents against one of our own, and we will treat it as such. Meanwhile, the footage was spreading. The Ring doorbell video from across the street appeared first on a military spouse forum, uploaded by a neighbor who had obtained it with the homeowner's permission. Within hours, it was everywhere. The wide-angle footage showed everything in unbroken clarity. The SUVs skidding to a stop, the agents jumping out with weapons drawn, Drummond being forced to the ground, the zip ties, Elijah running out the front door screaming, Kircher pointing at the boy and shouting, Simone arriving in scrubs and demanding a warrant. Cell phone videos from other neighbors filled in the angles the doorbell camera couldn't reach, capturing close-up audio of Drummond calmly identifying himself and Kircher refusing to listen. The videos reached millions of views across platforms within days. National media picked it up by Monday morning. ICE issued a terse, 3-sentence statement that read like it had been drafted by a lawyer who already knew how bad this was going to get. The agency is reviewing the circumstances of a recent enforcement action in the Northern Virginia area. We are committed to ensuring all operations are conducted in accordance with applicable law and policy. No further comment at this time. The statement satisfied no one. It wasn't meant to. It was a placeholder from an agency that was already calculating how much damage control it was going to need and realizing the answer was far more than it could afford. Federal investigators pulled Dale Kircher's complete service record within the first week of the inquiry, and what they found was not a single lapse in judgment. It was a pattern so consistent and so deeply embedded that it could only be described as systematic. Over the past 3 years, Kircher had led 141 targeted enforcement actions across the Northern Virginia region. Of those 141, a staggering 117 had targeted Black or Latino individuals, the vast majority of them living in predominantly white neighborhoods. 34 of those operations resulted in confirmed wrongful detentions, meaning 34 people who were either United States citizens or legal permanent residents had been pulled from their homes, their cars, their daily lives, and detained by federal agents without proper verification of identity or legal status. Kircher had developed a practice of bypassing warrant procedures entirely, instead relying on exigent circumstances, claims that were written up after the fact, sometimes hours after a detention had already occurred, fabricated justifications inserted into paperwork to make unlawful actions appear lawful on paper. But the most damning evidence came from inside the agency itself. Internal emails between Kircher and Skaggs, recovered during the digital forensics review, revealed a casual and dehumanizing language that stripped every pretense of professionalism from their operations. They referred to black neighborhoods as hunting grounds. They joked about bagging suspects the way a person might talk about a weekend sport. In one exchange, Kircher had written to Skaggs about an upcoming operation in a mixed-income suburb, saying, "Easy pickings out there. Nobody fights back when you roll up fast enough." Skaggs had replied with a laughing emoji and the words, "Let's go get some." The body camera non-activation was not an occasional oversight. It was systemic. Kircher had failed to record on more than 60 documented enforcement actions. Skaggs had gaps on 23. And in every single instance where recordings were missing, the operations had involved minorities, and in many cases had generated complaints that went nowhere because there was no footage to support them. Kircher's supervisors had been aware of the pattern. They had seen the complaint files, they had reviewed the demographic data, and they had never disciplined him once. Not a written warning, not a suspension, not even a conversation. The suspensions came down fast once the evidence started moving through federal channels. Dale Kircher was suspended without pay, pending the outcome of the federal investigation. Troy Skaggs was suspended the same day under the same terms. Two supervisors who had signed off on the flawed intelligence packet that led to Drummond's arrest, and who had for years ignored the mounting pattern of complaints against Kircher, were placed on administrative leave. Their access to federal systems was revoked. Their credentials were collected. The ICE Field Office Director for the Northern Virginia region issued a public apology that was carried by every major outlet and immediately criticized as insufficient. He called the incident regrettable and said the agency was committed to reviewing its internal processes to ensure accountability. He did not name Kircher. He did not name Skaggs. He did not acknowledge the 34 prior wrongful detentions or the emails or the body camera failures. He spoke in the careful, empty language of a man trying to contain a fire that had already burned past the walls. Congressional hearings were announced within the week. The chair of the House Armed Services Committee called the detention of Colonel Drummond a disgrace to every principle of constitutional protection and an insult to the men and women who serve this country in uniform. A Marine Corps two-star general issued a rare public statement that carried none of the diplomatic softness of the ICE apology. The detention of one of our senior officers, a combat veteran and Bronze Star recipient, without warrant, without cause, and without basic verification, is an unconscionable failure that we will pursue to its fullest accountability. The statement was read on the floor of Congress the following day. Kircher's attorney appeared on cable news that evening and told a host that his client was simply following established protocols. The host asked a single follow-up question. Did those protocols include obtaining a warrant? The attorney paused. Did they include verifying the target's identity before making an arrest? Another pause. Did they include activating a body camera as required by federal policy? The attorney declined to answer, because the protocols Kircher claimed to follow did not include any of those things, and everyone watching already knew it. The federal indictments came down 6 weeks after the investigation began. A grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia charged Senior Field Agent Dale Kircher with deprivation of rights under color of law under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, conspiracy to deprive civil rights under 18 U.S.C. Section 241, and filing false reports tied to fabricated exigent circumstances claims. Troy Skaggs was indicted as a co-conspirator. The trial lasted 4 weeks. The jury watched the Ring doorbell footage in silence, then the cell phone videos from 4 neighbors, then heard Drummond's calm voice identifying himself over and over while Kircher dismissed him. They heard a 1-4-year-old boy screaming for his father. Then came the internal emails, the hunting grounds messages, the easy pickings exchange, the laughing emoji followed by "let's go get some." 34 prior wrongful detention victims took the stand over 6 days. A Latino father pulled from his car in front of his daughters. A black grandmother detained in her bathrobe while agents ransacked her home looking for a man who never lived there. A legal resident held for 9 hours without a phone call. Each story different in detail but identical in architecture. The defense argued Kircher acted within the scope of his duties. The jury deliberated for a day and a half, guilty on all counts. Kircher was sentenced to 5 years and 4 months in federal prison. Skaggs received 2 years. 2 supervisors were terminated and permanently barred from federal law enforcement. The Drummond family filed a civil rights lawsuit against ICE, Kircher, Skaggs, and DHS. The case settled for $4.7 million, one of the largest individual ICE misconduct settlements in recent history. Mandated reforms included independent oversight of targeted enforcement actions, mandatory warrant verification, real-time body camera compliance monitoring, and quarterly demographic audits of every field agent's enforcement patterns. Colonel Nathaniel Drummond returned to full active duty at Quantico. His commanding officer told him plainly that what had been done to him was a failure of the system, not a reflection of his service. 6 months later, Drummond was promoted with full honors. Simone pinned the new rank on his collar. Elijah stood beside them, quieter than he used to be, but standing. He had started therapy 3 weeks after the arrest. The nightmares came less often now, though they hadn't stopped entirely. His therapist said recovery wasn't a straight line, that the basic feeling of safety taken from him in his own home would take time to rebuild. Drummond testified before Congress in full Marine dress blues. He spoke about the intersection of military service and civil rights, about what it meant to spend 26 years defending a constitution that could not protect him in his own driveway. Every member of the committee sat in silence as he spoke. The Drummond family established the Drummond Justice Initiative, a nonprofit providing legal defense to citizens wrongfully targeted by federal enforcement agencies. Within its first year, the initiative took on 19 cases. Kircher served his sentence. He never apologized. Skaggs, in a post-sentencing interview, said something Kircher never could. "I should have said something. I knew it was wrong, and I followed anyway. Watching that boy run out screaming for his father, I knew right then, and I didn't stop it. They came for him without a warrant, without cause, without humanity. They forgot that the man on the concrete had spent 26 years defending the country they claimed to serve. And when the system turned, it didn't just correct itself, it crushed every career that made it possible. This case was brutal, but the case on the right spirals completely out of control.
Step away from the door! Keep your hands up where I can see them!
My residence. Identify yourself and state your authority.
You can explain that downtown. Turn around, right now!
I am a... You are making a serious...
I don't care what you say you are! You're being...
At 6:47 a.m., on a quiet Saturday morning in Pasadena, California, a black woman in a bathrobe stepped out of her front door to retrieve the newspaper from the end of her driveway. Birds were singing, coffee was brewing inside, 2 grandchildren were still asleep in the guest room down the hall. The street was lined with mature oaks and well-kept homes, the kind of neighborhood where nothing ever happened. The woman was Justice Vivian Ashford, 58 years old, Associate Justice of the California Supreme Court. She had spent more than 30 years in law. She had served as a federal prosecutor, then as an appellate judge, before being appointed to the state's highest court 6 years earlier. Legal scholars called her one of the sharpest minds on the bench. She had written landmark opinions on civil liberties, police accountability, and constitutional protections that were cited in law schools across the country. That morning, none of that mattered to the men inside the black SUV rolling slowly down Mariposa Lane. All they saw was a black woman standing alone in a driveway, and that was enough. The man behind the wheel of that SUV was ICE Supervisory Agent Dalton Voss, 44 years old, 16 years with the agency. Voss was known internally for what supervisors politely called high-yield operations. In practice, that meant aggressive tactics, maximum arrests, and minimal paperwork. He ran his team like every sweep was a raid, every target a threat, every door an obstacle. 9 formal complaints had been filed against him by civil rights attorneys over the years. Every single one had been buried or dismissed. Sitting beside him was Agent Nolan Strack, 31, 4 years on the job, the kind of junior agent who never questioned a senior officer's call. Strack followed Voss the way a shadow follows a body. He laughed when Voss laughed. He moved when Voss moved. And when Voss made a decision, Strack backed it without hesitation. That morning, the two of them were running a targeted immigration sweep in the Pasadena area based on a tip about undocumented individuals somewhere in the neighborhood. Their warrant named a specific address, 412 Mariposa Lane. Justice Vivian Ashford lived at 414 Mariposa Lane, one house over, 2 digits apart, but Voss never double-checked. He didn't verify the house number, he didn't confirm the name on the mailbox, he didn't cross-reference the address on the warrant with the property in front of him. He saw a black woman in a driveway, and his assumptions did the rest. He put the SUV in park, opened his door, and stepped onto the curb with the confidence of a man who had never once been held accountable for being wrong. Voss stepped out of the SUV first. Strack followed half a second later. 2 additional agents climbed out from the back seats, both in tactical vests with ICE printed across the chest. 4 federal agents, armed and deliberate, walking up the driveway of a 5-8-year-old woman in a bathrobe holding a Saturday newspaper. Voss led the approach. His hand rested on his belt. His posture was wide, aggressive, the stance of a man who had already decided how this was going to go before a single word was spoken. He stopped 5 feet from Ashford and didn't introduce himself, didn't show credentials, didn't explain why 4 armed men were standing on her property before 7 in the morning. He started with a command. "I need to see identification. Who are you? Who else is inside this residence? Are you a United States citizen?" Ashford looked at the 4 men, then back at Voss. Her voice was steady. "My name is Vivian Ashford. I am an Associate Justice of the California Supreme Court. This is my home." Voss tilted his head slightly and let out a short laugh. "Sure you are." He glanced at Strack. "People say all kinds of things." Strack moved without being told, stepping to the side and positioning himself between Ashford and her front door. She noticed it immediately. She had spent 3 decades in courtrooms reading body language, watching how power was used and misused. She knew what a blocked exit meant. "Do you have a warrant for this address?" she asked. Voss ignored the question entirely. "Put your hands where I can see them." She was standing in her own driveway, in her bathrobe, holding a newspaper. And a federal agent was telling her to show her hands as if she were a suspect in a crime that didn't exist. Ashford spoke again, slower this time, each word delivered with the precision of someone who had spent a career choosing language carefully. "I am Justice Vivian Ashford of the California Supreme Court. I am asking you again, do you have a warrant for this address?" Voss stepped closer. "That mouth is going to get you in trouble." His right hand shot out and grabbed her arm just above the elbow. He spun her around hard enough that her slippers scraped across the concrete. The newspaper slipped from her fingers and landed flat on the driveway. Her reading glasses, knocked loose from the force of the turn, hit the pavement and cracked. Strack moved in immediately, taking her other arm and pulling it behind her back. Ashford's voice stayed controlled even as her body was being forced into position. "You are making a grave mistake." "I am not resisting." Voss didn't respond. He pulled a set of handcuffs from his belt and locked them around her wrists. The metallic click echoed in the early morning silence. A sitting justice of the California Supreme Court was now in handcuffs in her own driveway, detained by federal agents who had no warrant for her address, no probable cause, and no legal basis to touch her. Across the street, Edwin Choi, 72, a retired aerospace engineer, had been watering his garden when the SUV pulled up. He watched the entire approach. When the handcuffs came out, he set down his hose, pulled his phone from his shirt pocket, and began recording. 2 doors down, Sandra Oyelerin, 45, a professor of applied physics at Caltech, stepped outside when she heard the raised voices. She saw Ashford in cuffs and shouted across the lawn, "What are you doing? Stop! Leave her alone!" Strack turned toward her. "Ma'am, go back inside your home, or you will be detained." Oyelerin didn't move. Her phone was already in her hand. Inside the house, the shouting reached the guest room at the end of the hall. Elijah, 10, woke first. He sat up in bed and listened. The voices were sharp, male, commanding. They didn't belong to anyone he knew. He slid out of bed and walked to the front window of the living room. What he saw through the glass would stay with him for the rest of his life. His grandmother was standing in the driveway in her bathrobe, her arms behind her back, metal cuffs around her wrists. 4 men in tactical vests with guns on their hips surrounded her. One of them had his hand on her shoulder. Elijah screamed. The sound woke Simone, 7, who came running down the hallway calling for her grandmother. When she reached the living room and saw her brother pressed against the window, shaking, she began to cry. Neither child understood what was happening. Neither child had been told. Before either of them could reach the front door, it opened from the outside. A third agent, one of the two who had exited the back of the SUV, stepped into the home without knocking, without permission, and without a warrant. He saw the 2 children standing in the living room, one screaming, one sobbing. He reached for his radio. "There are kids in here." Voss's voice came back through the speaker, flat and unbothered. "Secure them." The agent looked at Elijah and Simone. "Sit down on the couch. Don't move." Simone's voice broke through her tears. "Where's my grandma? What are you doing to my grandma?" The agent said nothing. He stood near the door with his arms crossed and offered no comfort, no explanation, no reassurance. 2 children, 10 and 7, held in place on their grandmother's couch by an armed federal agent who had entered the home without legal authority. That detail, when it became public, would become the single most explosive element of the entire case, and it was already being recorded. Across the street, Edwin Choi held his phone steady with both hands. The camera captured everything. Ashford in cuffs, her calm, measured protests. Voss standing over her with his chest out and his jaw set. Strack positioned between her and the front door like a wall. The cracked reading glasses on the pavement. The newspaper lying where it had fallen. Every frame was sharp. Every word was audible. 2 doors down, Sandra Oyelaran recorded from her front yard at a different angle. Her hands were shaking visibly, not from fear but from anger. Her footage caught what Choi's couldn't. The moment the third agent pushed open the front door and disappeared inside the house without anyone inviting him in. Choi lowered his phone just long enough to dial 911. When the dispatcher answered, he spoke quickly. "Federal agents are outside my neighbor's house. They've handcuffed her in her driveway. She's a justice of the California Supreme Court." There was a pause on the line. "Sir, can you repeat that?" He said it again, slower. "They have her in handcuffs. She's a sitting justice. They're in her house now. There are children inside." The dispatcher flagged the call as priority. Oyelaran didn't wait for 911. She called the Pasadena Police Department directly. Her voice was tight, controlled, furious. She gave the address, described what she was seeing, and demanded officers respond immediately. A jogger who had been running up Mariposa Lane slowed, then stopped completely when he saw the scene. He pulled out his phone and began filming from the sidewalk. No one told him to leave. No one noticed him at all. Within 20 minutes of Voss stepping out of that SUV, 3 independent recordings existed from 3 different angles. None of them showed a crime being committed by Vivian Ashford. All of them showed crimes being committed against her. The Pasadena PD cruiser came around the corner of Mariposa Lane 7 minutes after the 911 call. 2 officers stepped out. The first was Sergeant Diana Reeves, 46, a 19-year veteran of the department with a reputation for being calm under pressure and intolerant of nonsense. Her partner stayed near the vehicle. Reeves took in the scene in 3 seconds. A black woman in a bathrobe, handcuffed in a driveway, 4 men in tactical vests with ice markings, neighbors on porches with phones raised, cracked glasses on the ground, a newspaper lying in the middle of the concrete. She walked straight to Voss. "What's going on here?" Voss didn't look at her when he answered. "Immigration enforcement operation. Federal matter. Local PD can stand down." Reeves didn't move. "I'm not standing down." I responded to a 911 call reporting a unlawful detention. "Show me the warrant." Voss exhaled through his nose, annoyed, but reached into his vest and produced the folded document. He handed it over like it proved something. Reeves opened it. Her eyes moved to the address line. 2412 Mariposa Lane. She looked up. Then she looked at the house. At the numbers beside the front door, 414. She folded the warrant and handed it back. "You're at the wrong house." Voss blinked. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Strack, standing 2 steps behind him, went pale. Reeves continued, "And this woman is Justice Vivian Ashford of the California Supreme Court. Remove the handcuffs." "Now." Voss didn't move. "We're still verifying the situation." "There's nothing to verify," Reeves said. "You're at the wrong address. Your warrant doesn't apply here. Take the cuffs off." Voss shifted his weight. His jaw tightened. He looked at Strack, then back at Reeves. "I need to confirm with my Sergeant." Reeves raised her voice. She didn't shout, but every person on that street heard her clearly. "I said remove the handcuffs. Now." Across the street, Edwin Choi's phone captured every second. The hesitation, the defiance. The moment a local sergeant had to tell a federal agent twice to stop breaking the law. The standoff lasted several more minutes. Voss stood with his feet planted, jaw locked, the posture of a man trying to find a way to maintain authority he had already lost. Reeves didn't repeat herself a third time. She simply stood between Voss and Ashford with her Bodycam running and waited. It was Strack who finally moved. He stepped forward, reached for the cuffs, and looked at Voss. Voss gave a barely perceptible nod, the kind of gesture a man makes when he wants to pretend the decision was still his. The cuffs came off. Ashford brought her wrists forward slowly. The skin was red, pressed with the pattern of the metal. Her robe had twisted and pulled loose during the struggle. Her reading glasses lay cracked on the pavement beside the newspaper she had come outside to collect what now felt like a lifetime ago. She was trembling, not from fear. Vivian Ashford had faced down hostile courtrooms, argued before federal panels, and written opinions that changed the legal landscape of an entire state. She was trembling from fury, the kind that doesn't explode but calculates. She turned to Voss and looked directly into his face. "You entered my property without a warrant. You put your hands on me without cause. You sent an agent into my home where my grandchildren were sleeping. I want your full names. I want your badge numbers. I want your supervisor's name and contact information. Every single word of what just happened is going to matter." Voss's tone shifted. Smaller now. "Ma'am, it was a mistake. We had the wrong address." Ashford didn't blink. "A mistake is knocking on the wrong door. What you did was assault." Reeves stepped to the side, keyed her radio, and spoke clearly. "Captain, this is Reeves on Mariposa Lane. We have a major incident. Federal agents detained a sitting California Supreme Court justice at her home without a warrant. Children were involved. I need command staff here immediately." There was a pause on the other end. Then a voice came back. "Repeat that." Reeves repeated it, word for word. The silence that followed said everything. Within the hour, the phone calls began. They started local and climbed fast. Sergeant Reeves's captain arrived on scene, took one look at the situation, and called the Pasadena city attorney from his car. The city attorney listened for less than a minute before calling the California Attorney General's office. That call was answered immediately. Inside the house, Vivian Ashford sat at her kitchen table. Her grandchildren were in the next room with a neighbor who had come over to sit with them. Simone had stopped crying but wouldn't let go of her brother's hand. Elijah hadn't spoken a word since the agents left the front porch. Ashford was still in her bathrobe. Her wrists still carried the red impressions of the cuffs. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was not. She picked up the phone and called the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court. She gave a precise, factual account. No emotion, no editorializing, just the facts. Federal agents arrived at my home at approximately 6:50 a.m. They had a warrant for a different address. They handcuffed me in my driveway. They entered my home without permission. My grandchildren were inside. They were held by an armed agent without explanation. The Chief Justice listened without interrupting. When Ashford finished, the Chief Justice made one call to the governor's office. The governor's office made one call to the United States Department of Justice. By mid-morning, the incident on Mariposa Lane had reached Washington. Separately, Sandra O'Yeleran sat on her front steps with her phone in her hand. She trimmed her video down to 90 seconds, the most damning 90 seconds, and posted it to social media with a caption that read, "ICE agents just handcuffed a California Supreme Court justice in her driveway in her bathrobe, in front of her grandchildren. They had the wrong house." Within 2 hours, the video had been viewed over 1 million times, and it was still climbing. By that afternoon, the DHS Office of Inspector General had opened a formal investigation. ICE headquarters in Washington was blindsided. No one at the agency's national level had authorized or been made aware of a high-profile enforcement operation at a judicial officer's residence. Voss's operational paperwork was pulled within hours. The warrant was reviewed line by line. The target address was 412 Mariposa Lane. Ashford's home was 414. The file contained no pre-operation verification of the target address, no confirmation that the location matched the warrant, no cross-referencing of neighboring properties, no awareness whatsoever that a sitting justice of the California Supreme Court lived one house over from the intended target. Internal reviewers also discovered that Voss's team had conducted no surveillance before the operation, no drive-by, no advanced scout, no visual confirmation. Pre-operation surveillance was standard protocol for residential enforcement actions, a basic safeguard designed to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophic error. Voss had skipped it entirely. His file showed a pattern of shortcuts, operations launched on incomplete intelligence, addresses verified after the fact rather than before, paperwork filed retroactively. A senior DHS official convened a closed-door briefing later that day. According to 2 people present, the official stood at the head of the table, looked around the room, and said, "This is the worst operational failure I have seen in 20 years. They handcuffed a sitting justice, on camera, with children in the house. No one in the room responded. There was nothing to say. The footage was already everywhere. The phone calls had already reached the highest levels of government. And the machinery of accountability, slow as it often was, had already begun to move in a direction that Dalton Voss and Nolan Strack could not outrun. The investigators moved fast. Within 48 hours of the incident, every piece of available evidence had been collected, cataloged, and placed under federal review. Body camera footage was the first priority. Voss's camera had not been activated. He claimed later it was an oversight, that the device had malfunctioned, that he hadn't realized it wasn't recording. Investigators noted that this was the 4th time in 3 years Voss had failed to activate his body camera during a field operation that resulted in a complaint. The pattern was not lost on anyone reviewing the file. But Strack's camera had been running, from the moment he stepped out of the SUV to the moment Sergeant Reeves ordered the cuffs removed. His body cam captured everything. The footage confirmed every detail. Ashford's calm, measured identification of herself, Voss's dismissive laugh, the words, "Sure you are," spoken with a tone that no amount of context could soften. Strack blocking the path to the front door, Voss grabbing her arm, the newspaper falling, the glasses cracking on the pavement, the handcuffs locking into place, and inside the house, picked up through the open front door, the sound of children screaming. Investigators also pulled Edwin Choi's cell phone video, Sandra O'Yeleran's recording from her front yard, the jogger's footage from the sidewalk, Sergeant Reeves's body cam, the 911 audio, dispatch logs, and every operational planning document associated with that morning's sweep. Each source told the same story from a different angle. None of them contradicted each other. All of them pointed in the same direction. Internal Affairs then pulled Voss's personnel file. 9 formal complaints from civil rights attorneys spanning more than a decade. 2 of those complaints specifically alleged racial profiling during immigration enforcement sweeps. Both had been dismissed without a full investigation. 3 others cited excessive force during residential operations. All closed with findings of insufficient evidence. The pattern didn't emerge slowly. It was already there, fully formed, waiting for someone to finally look at it. The story broke nationally on a Monday morning. By Tuesday, it was everywhere. Every major network ran the footage. Cable news played it on a loop. The cell phone videos from Choi and Oyelaran were embedded in every online article, shared millions of times, commented on in dozens of languages. Legal commentators used words that rarely appeared in cable news segments. Unprecedented violation of judicial independence, constitutional crisis at the doorstep, assault on the separation of powers. One former federal judge, speaking on a morning broadcast, said plainly that in 40 years of practice, he had never seen a sitting member of a state's highest court handcuffed by federal agents on her own property without a warrant. The California State Bar issued a formal statement condemning the incident and calling for a full federal investigation. The NAACP demanded immediate accountability and structural reform within ICE. Civil liberties organizations filed amicus briefs in support of any future legal action before a case had even been announced. A press conference was held midweek. Civil rights attorneys stood behind a podium with Ashford's permission and displayed two photographs. The first showed her wrists, bruised and marked where the handcuffs had pressed into her skin. The second showed her reading glasses, cracked and lying on the driveway concrete. The images were published on the front page of 4 national newspapers, but it was a quote from a 10-year-old boy that cut through everything else. In a newspaper interview conducted with his mother's consent, Elijah sat in his grandmother's living room and said 7 words that became the defining line of the national conversation. "I saw my grandma in handcuffs. I thought they were going to take her away." That quote was reprinted in editorials, cited in congressional floor speeches, and shared so widely online that it became impossible to discuss the case without hearing it. Protests formed outside the ICE field office in Los Angeles. They were calm, organized, and persistent. Elected officials at every level, city council members, state legislators, members of Congress, issued public statements demanding answers. And in Pasadena, on a quiet street where the house numbers 412 and 414 sat side by side, the answers were already taking shape in the form of evidence that no statement, no press briefing, and no internal review could make disappear. The terminations came down 5 weeks after the incident. There was no quiet reassignment, no administrative leave stretched into silence, no resignation accepted in lieu of discipline. The findings were made public and the language was unsparing. Supervisory Agent Dalton Voss was terminated for gross misconduct, operational negligence, excessive use of force, failure to verify a warrant address prior to execution, unauthorized entry into a private residence, failure to activate a body camera during a field operation, and conduct unbecoming a federal agent. His federal law enforcement credentials were revoked. He was barred from future employment with any federal agency. 16 years with ICE, 9 buried complaints, and a career built on shortcuts and aggression ended in a single memorandum of termination that would follow his name for the rest of his life. Agent Nolan Strack was fired for failure to intervene during an unlawful detention, active participation in the warrantless restraint of a civilian, and enabling the unauthorized entry into a private home where minor children were present. His credentials were suspended pending further review, a formality that effectively guaranteed he would never work in federal law enforcement again. 4 years of following without questioning. 4 years of backing every call, laughing at every joke, never once saying, "Stop." That silence now carried a price. The 2 additional agents who had been on scene received formal reprimands and multi-week suspensions without pay. One of them, the agent who had entered the home and stood over 2 terrified children without offering a word of explanation, was reassigned to a desk position indefinitely. Voss's former supervisor, the man who had reviewed and dismissed 9 complaints over more than a decade, was placed under internal review. The review found a pattern of deliberate inaction, complaints from civil rights attorneys filed and never followed up, red flags documented and never escalated. He was given 2 options, early retirement or formal proceedings. He chose retirement. ICE's regional field office director, who had overseen the unit responsible for that morning's sweep, was reassigned to a non-operational role in Washington. A federal consent decree was imposed on the regional office requiring sweeping reforms: mandatory pre-operation address verification with independent sign-off, body camera activation required for all field operations with automatic disciplinary triggers for non-compliance, a civilian oversight panel with authority to review operational planning and complaint disposition. The decree would remain in effect for 5 years, monitored by a federal judge. The machinery that had protected Dalton Voss for 16 years had finally been forced to dismantle the system it had built around him. 8 weeks after the terminations, Justice Vivian Ashford filed a federal civil rights lawsuit in the United States District Court for the Central District of California. The defendants were Dalton Voss, Nolan Strack, the 2 additional agents, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Department of Homeland Security. The complaint was 47 pages long. It alleged unlawful detention in violation of the 4th and 14th Amendments, excessive force against a compliant, unarmed civilian, warrantless entry into a private residence, unlawful seizure of a person without probable cause, racial profiling as a motivating factor in the agent's decision-making, intentional infliction of emotional distress upon both the justice and her 2 minor grandchildren, and a claim that appeared in no standard civil rights template, violation of judicial independence through the physical detention and restraint of a sitting member of a state's highest court by agents of the federal executive branch. The evidence attached to the complaint was overwhelming: Strack's body camera footage, 3 independent cell phone recordings, Sergeant Reeves's body cam, the 911 audio, dispatch logs, the warrant showing the wrong address, Voss's operational file showing no pre-operation verification, his personnel record showing 9 dismissed complaints, photographs of Ashford's bruised wrists, photographs of her cracked glasses on the pavement, a written statement from the agent who entered the home confirming that he encountered 2 minor children inside and was instructed by Voss to secure them, medical records documenting the children's subsequent treatment for anxiety and sleep disturbances. The government's attorneys reviewed the evidence and requested a settlement conference before the case reached discovery. The settlement was reached 4 months later. The dollar amount was historic, placing it among the largest civil rights settlements ever paid in a case involving federal immigration enforcement. But Ashford had made clear from the beginning that money alone was not the point. The settlement included structural demands that went far beyond the regional consent decree: a national review of ICE operational protocols for residential enforcement actions, mandatory address verification procedures requiring independent confirmation before any warrant execution at a private residence, a civilian complaint review process with binding authority over disposition of misconduct allegations, annual civil rights audits of enforcement teams conducted by an independent body with public reporting requirements. Legal scholars called it one of the most consequential civil rights settlements in the history of federal immigration enforcement. Law journals published analyses of the case before the ink on the agreement was dry, and Ashford, in a brief public statement released the day the settlement was finalized, announced that a portion of the funds would be donated to establish a legal defense fund for immigrant families who had been subjected to unlawful raids and had no resources to fight back. She said simply, "I had a name and a title that forced people to pay attention. Most people who experience what I experienced do not. This fund is for them." Justice Vivian Ashford returned to the bench 6 weeks after the settlement was finalized. There was no press conference. She simply walked into the courthouse on a Monday morning, put on her robe, and took her seat. She rarely spoke about the incident publicly. She declined most interview requests and turned down invitations to speak at rallies and panels. But once, in a rare sit-down with a legal journal, she said something that would be quoted more than any opinion she had ever written. "I am a justice of the highest court in this state. If they did this to me in my driveway, in my bathrobe, imagine what they do to people who have no title, no camera, no neighbor willing to record. That is why this matters." Dalton Voss left California within months of his termination. His name was permanently tied to the case. Every search returned the same footage, the same headlines. No agency would consider him. No security firm would take the risk. The career built on aggression and shortcuts was gone, replaced by a record that would define him for the rest of his life. Nolan Strack learned that silence carried its own sentence. He had not given the orders. But he had blocked her path, helped force her arms behind her back, and when the moment came to intervene, he did nothing. His career ended with the quiet, documented absence of conscience. Months later, Elijah's fifth-grade teacher assigned a personal essay. He wrote 4 pages in pencil titled "The Morning They Took My Grandma." It was published unedited by a national magazine and became one of the most widely shared pieces of the year. In Pasadena, on a quiet street where the numbers 412 and 414 sit side by side, a Supreme Court justice still retrieves her newspaper every morning. No one has come to her driveway since. This case was brutal, but this case on the right-hand side is even more insane.